Well, good morning, everyone. Great to be here with you today. And thank you for joining the second day of GCA's Masterclass on Climate Resilient Infrastructure PPPs. It's great to be with you again. Thank you also for everyone that joined the opening ceremony and the keynote lecture of the Masterclass yesterday. Today we are discussing about two topics. Climate risk as a resilience assessment of infrastructure and investment planning under uncertainty. And we have today Scott and Mónica to give a presentation to us. So it's a pleasure to be here. And apologies, I just realized that one of the slides had a small mistake there. So apologies for the typo. And thank you everyone for joining. And for today's session, just a quick reminder that the session is being recorded and it's going to be available at GCA's website after the presentation. And we'll welcome everyone to turn on their cameras so we can have a very interactive discussion. And please do not feel hesitant to engage, send questions in the chat, and to speak also during the Q&A session. So without further ado, I would like to introduce David, who you met yesterday. And David will moderate this session. David, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're located. We met yesterday, so I won't do an introduction. I'm very pleased that we've had the opportunity to carry on with this next session. We have two great speakers, and I'll introduce them in time. Please feel free to send me questions through the chat function. And when we get to the question and answer session, I will ask you to activate your screen if it's not active and to unmute and then ask your question directly to each of the presenters. The first presenter that we have is we are going to have Scott Thacker, Dr. Scott Thacker, who is a well-known in the field of infrastructure at UNOPS. He is an infrastructure specialist at UNOPS and also is associated with the University of Oxford, if I've got that correct. I hope I didn't mix up the universities. Scott is supporting governments to prioritize infrastructure investment and policies around the world. And he's also this also includes an ongoing project in Ghana with GCA. Scott, with much anticipation of what you're going to say, I'm going to hand the floor over to you. And if you could please start with your presentation.
Thank you very much, David, for that introduction, and good day, everybody. It's fantastic to be here as part of this.
Scott?
Your voice is fading out, if you could.
Okay. I hope that this is an improvement. Is that better? Okay. I see a couple of people nodding. Is that better? Sorry.
Yes, if you keep close to your screen, it's better, or your mic.
Okay. Please do let me know if it drops out. I'll share my screen now. Okay. So. As I was saying, it's a great pleasure to be a part of this session today and to be able to communicate some of the work that we're doing at UNOPS in partnership with different governments around the world and other knowledge partners in this space, including the GCA. I'll be presenting on resilient infrastructure for sustainable development. I wanted to start by introducing UNOPS as a way to really to kind of frame where this presentation comes from. And that is that at UNOPS, we're a part of the UN system, part of the big family, but we are a little different to some other parts in the UN in that we are self-financing. So we operate in a way more like the private sector, which is something interesting in itself. We provide support to governments through advisory technical services, through implementation and transactional support. And we do this in multiple areas, including in infrastructure. We are reasonably large. We delivered about $2.2 billion worth of support last year across 1,000 projects. And we did that across 80 different countries. I'm based in Copenhagen, which is where we're headquartered, but we operate in a diverse range of countries and contexts globally. And like many other parts of the UN system, we are extremely interested in Agenda 2030 and advancing life on this planet towards the broad objectives set out within the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm not sure the extent to which the attendees work with or have been exposed to the Sustainable Development Goals, but they represent a blueprint for the future of life on this planet. That covers 17 different focus areas. 3 of those are very related to infrastructure. So we have SDG 9, SDG 6 and SDG 7, so water, energy, and a general one on infrastructure. But at UNOPS, in the work we do around the world in the support of our partners, we recognize that infrastructure is a central component to all forms of development. If you want to target hunger in a particular country, it's essential that you have water infrastructure in place for irrigation. It's essential that you have transport networks in place to enable a well-functioning food system. If you want to target gender equality, this is again in part through infrastructure. We need to ensure that the services that are provided are equitable, and we need to ensure that they are inclusive. And it's really this general question about infrastructure and development that had encouraged us within UNOPS in collaboration with the University of Oxford to think and to try to characterize and quantify, well, what is this influence of infrastructure on development? How influential is it, and in which ways does it work? We published a study in the journal Nature 2 years ago, and we have this a practitioner-facing document here that highlighted that, in fact, infrastructure can have a profound influence on the Sustainable Development Goals and can actually influence 92% of the targets of the SDGs across these 17 different dimensions of development. We're interested not only in the SDGs, but also more generally in an area that's perhaps more intuitively related to adaptation, which is generally climate action. We have a report that we're launching in a similar vein next month, a report that's coming out again with Oxford and UNEP that's characterizing the central role of infrastructure for climate action, and in doing so, on delivering upon the objectives set out in the Paris Agreement. And again, through a review and synthesis of the literature in the area, we find that infrastructure sectors are responsible for 79% of all greenhouse gas emissions, and infrastructure sectors account for 88% of forecast adaptation costs. So this really places infrastructure central towards achieving the Paris Agreement and our climate objectives. We cannot think about infrastructure without thinking about climate change, and we cannot think about delivering climate action without thinking about infrastructure. And this is, of course, incredibly important because it shows that infrastructure represents both opportunity and risk. As we are developing currently infrastructure at a faster rate than at any other time in the history of our planet. And as we seek to, in the coming decades, develop trillions of dollars, there are lots of different numbers out there, but tens of trillions of dollars worth of infrastructure, we need to ensure that we do the right infrastructure and that infrastructure is done well. History provides too many examples of where poor decisions on infrastructure have locked in heavily polluting technologies along the long life cycle of infrastructure. They've entrenched vulnerabilities in communities and created unsustainable burdens of debt. But what infrastructure can do is it can provide an opportunity to realize unprecedented development gains and to make strong progress towards the SDGs and Paris Agreement. But that highlights the need for us to do the right infrastructure and to do it well. Within UNOPS and in partnership with Oxford, we think about that in these two sort of agreements that come together as resilient infrastructure for sustainable development. We want that in the future we develop sustainable infrastructure that provides essential services to communities. Looking at this graph on the horizontal axis, where we go from today, we want to be developing into the future. We want to provide basic services for communities. We want to ensure people the human dignity that services provide. But of course, climate change and the hazards associated with it, be those short-term shocks or long-term stresses, represent real shocks that can set back development progress decades. Let's say there's a large flood. This can destroy development gains that have taken years to establish. So what we're seeking to do here is to advance towards sustainable development, but to use adaptation to climate change to build resilience of infrastructures such that they can continue to operate and afford the services that people are entitled to. But also, if we choose well adaptation options, we're able then to achieve different co-benefits that can even enhance adaptation beyond simply safeguarding what's already there. A couple of shots just to sort of reiterate that key point. This is an earthquake examples of 2 earthquakes of the same magnitude in different countries and contexts, very different impacts, not only due to the destruction of buildings, but also in the aftermath of these earthquake hazards, the lack of provision of infrastructure services relating to transport, healthcare, water, sanitation in Haiti resulted in a huge number of fatalities. So having better infrastructure in terms of it having better design standards and for it being resilient can help safeguard development progress. But indeed, it can also deliver co-benefits through adaptation. In a piece of research we're undertaking with UNEP and Oxford, again, that we'll be publishing next year, we highlight that through adaptation, you can have co-benefits as well. You can advance development. And we find that nature-based solutions offer the greatest co-benefits, including over built infrastructure adaptation. And we find this and we characterize this, including in relation to the SDGs, where we find that NBS can be applicable to all sectors, can have benefits across all targets, which is an interesting piece of work. Now, to get more into the substance of this talk today, I wanted to introduce the approach that we have between UNOPS and Oxford towards characterizing resilience in countries to help countries understand their risks and better plan adaptation to safeguard development and enhance development benefits. We do this through geospatial risk analysis that represents the myriad parts of an infrastructure system, the assets, how they're interconnected, and the services that they provide. And we combine this with information on hazards and on the populations they serve to be able to characterize risk. The one model that we're using here is one developed over the past 10 years at the University of Oxford called NISMOD, the National Infrastructure Systems Model. I'll highlight 2 different countries where we've applied this to give you a sense of how we apply these type of studies in practice. In St. Lucia, we worked as with the Ministry of Finance as the focal ministry, but across 18 different ministries over the last year and a half to develop with them and for them a national infrastructure assessment that characterizes national risk to national assets and provides a strategy of investments, pipeline of investments to help address those needs in alignment with the SDGs and Paris Agreement. And we're currently, or next month with the Prime Minister, will be launching the National Infrastructure Financing Strategy. So just to give you a bit of a sense of what that looks like in practice. So we would bring together, or we have brought together, high resolution geospatial information on the location of different assets. And we overlay this with hazard information. So here we see the port facilities in St. Lucia, and we highlight not only which assets are at risk, but what the impacts of the failure of those assets relates to in terms of the services that they provide, so the tons of cargo, what the economic losses would be associated with those trade flows. And then on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see then how we link this to development benefits that the freight sector provides in terms of jobs created, in terms of the ways in which it underpins the manufacturing service, amongst others. And then so by sort of overlaying on this graph on the right, the percentage of national capacity at risk with the number of kind of aspects or dimensions of development that it supports, one is able to understand and characterize risk in a certain way that can aid prioritization. And indeed, it's prioritization that many governments are interested in. They've got scarce, very little budgets, very little resources, and they want to know, where do we optimally place our resources to be able to maximize or optimally reduce risk and maximize benefits from it? We work with governments to help do this in different ways. In St. Lucia, they were interested in, well, what's the risk profile across sectors for different hazards, and what are the risk characterization in different regions of the country, to think about how one might have a rationale for proportioning adaptation and resilience building budget. From this analysis, from identifying risks, we then work collaboratively with stakeholders to identify adaptation projects that can then address risks. We work with the government to ensure that they're contextually appropriate, and we highlight where they will address risk and offer co-benefits, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the SDGs, but also other co-benefits that we see are increasingly asked of projects. So including, for example, potential positive impacts towards gender outcomes, as well as the Paris Agreement. Alongside presenting project proposals, we also use our database that we have in-house called the Sustainable Infrastructure Financing Tool, which is a large database of infrastructure funds, we've reviewed those funds to see which sectors they fund, which financing mechanisms they offer, and which criteria they stipulate to award financing for projects. And we use that database to be able to steer governments towards possible sources of fund information. So these are funds that are provided by donors, IFIs and the like, that could be useful kind of parts of looking towards financing a pipeline of investments. It's not the whole piece, but it's a step in that direction. We do this alongside capacity development, handing over open source tools to the government. And in this case, we did a very large piece of capacity development in relative terms. We established within the Ministry of Finance a 5-person team. So we created a new team from scratch whose mandate it is to do strategic infrastructure planning for St. Lucia. This is a little bit like the National Infrastructure Commission in the UK or similar entities in Australia, Canada, Nigeria, and other ones. In Ghana, this is the second case study, and as I mentioned earlier, this is a really interesting and innovative piece of work being done with the GCA, as well as UNEP, Oxford, and various government ministries. MESTI is the focal point there. They own adaptation, or they have the adaptation lead and mandate within the government of Ghana, so they're the natural home for this. And much like St. Lucia, we have a very collaborative study we've developed with them over the past 18 months. That has 2 key phases that I'll talk about today, which lead up to this November, the launch of a key report, the Infrastructure Resilience Roadmap. The 2 stages were to identify the needs, so this is doing the needs assessment in country, where the adaptation needs are, and then secondly, to strategically identify a roadmap of strategic investments to kind of optimally meet those needs. Upon publishing this roadmap, we'll be seeking to accelerate the implementation of these projects, so working alongside financing partners to take these projects from concepts, which they are well-justified concepts that have emerged through evidence and through interaction with the government. These are government-led projects, but how we can accelerate those and how we can seek to attract financing of them. Much like St. Lucia, this is a geospatial analysis. We innovate on St. Lucia by including more in terms of nature-based solutions. But again, we're bringing tens of thousands of data points together to be able to map out infrastructure and understand hazard exposure and interdependent risks. But we also include a number of different variables for the enabling environment to characterize the way in which one might efficiently take this, understand performance in broad resilience terms, not only in terms of the built and natural environment, but also the enabling environment. Just to give you a little bit of an example of some of the analytics in there, this is just a slide on transport. Here we identify in a stakeholder-led process, so through different workshops, we identify many thousands of different needs in the country, but we need to work these down into a workable number of prioritized needs. And we do this by using the model to develop targeted information. We do some economic analysis where data permits. So for example, understanding assets at risk and basically economic damages in sort of risk terms. And then we also look at some of the services that these different assets provide in terms of, say, access to healthcare centres or passenger numbers through airports. And we bring this synthesis of information together to be able to then work with the stakeholders to be able to identify which are the priority areas from your perspective, based on the analytics and the modelling, which are the areas you want to target to build and enhance resilience. And through long consultation with the government to ensure it's government owned, we identify 36 priority investments that the government is wanting to push through this. 16 in the built environment, 14 in the natural environment, so nature-based solutions, and 12 from the enabling environments. This is in the capacity development space. And those are split across our different sectors, and some of those are cross-sectoral. And much like in St. Lucia, we present these as project concepts, and we present information on potential sources of funding here, albeit the financing stream for this and the long-term implementation is within the hands of the GCA, and we look forward to working with them to sort of build off this and think about how financing can be leveraged to make this roadmap, this prioritized portfolio of investments a reality. Just two more slides. This is the last one on the Ghana study. Again, it involves training in country to be able to empower people within the country to be able to undertake this type of analysis into the future. We provide and build open source tools. They're not obliged to pay any licensing fees into the future. Open source tools that can be used. Here's a screenshot of one such tool that is used. There's a whole toolbox, different tools that are used for different things, but this is one particular tool that can be used to do, to be able to understand and explore hazard impacts based on different scenarios. But we held a very interesting training workshop last month, which had its challenges with COVID, but the team on the ground there made it exceptionally easy. From the perspective of their willingness to get stuck in, and the attendees were fantastic. So on to the final slide, conclusions. Our perspective really is one that climate adaptation can help us to safeguard and enhance development. As a part of the UN, we're really keen on broad development. Absolutely, that must include economic development. We need it in economic terms. There's no getting away from that. It's important. We need to do our CBA. We need to think about the economy, but it's also important that we bring people along and that we protect the environment along the way. So we try to have a broad view of environmental and social impacts alongside economic ones, and try to place those at an important level within our risk characterization and adaptations options appraisal. The second point is that it's essential that we systematically explore adaptation needs. We need to exhaustively look across a country under different scenarios to have a true picture, or have a more informed picture, I should say, as to what the risks faced are. And then finally, on the analytical point, that we need to then identify priority investments, because of course there are many, many hundreds or thousands of things that we can do. What the challenge is to decide which are the ones that can offer the greatest benefit for the country and its development into the future. And we need to be able to make those applicable, make them stick, get financing for them. I made a comment earlier, and I repeat it here, that open source tools and training is central to enabling legacy in this area. We need to make this become the norm, and we can only really do that by building capacity in countries for them to own this kind of process. And then finally, it's really to thank you all again for being a part of this process. And I think it's incredibly timely as we start in the first couple of years of the decade of action towards the SDGs and Paris Agreement. There's really no time to waste. There's risk and opportunity here. But certainly through this type of initiative and others, to be able to build the knowledge base, to be able to support developing more sustainable, inclusive, resilient infrastructure is of great need, and it's very timely for people and planet. So that's the last bit from my side, and I'm happy to welcome any questions.
Thank you, Scott. It was very informative. I just have one question, and then I will open the floor to people who have been feeding questions to us. In many countries that I've often worked in, they stress that we have 17 sustainable development goals. How do we achieve them all? And my advice to them has always been that these goals actually are very interrelated, and sometimes maybe you should even just prioritize the sustainable development goals for your country before you start, any strategy. Any thoughts in that regard? Because it can be quite a daunting list to look at 17 sustainable development goals.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's something that we hear often. And our experience across different countries is that countries more or less have capacity in this area or have history in this area of prioritizing around the SDGs. If we take Ghana, for example, their national development plan is grounded in the SDGs. So a lot of time and energy has already been put into thinking about which areas are important for them. Indeed, they leverage off global efforts, including those through, for example, the SDG Index, which characterizes SDG performance of most countries around the world, to be able to understand where their SDG-related development needs are as a country and use that to help inform where the development strategy is. Now, that's certainly not the situation, in every country, and nor will it be in the near future. And so even though we would hope that progress is made to try to be expansive in terms of development, our practical suggestion would indeed be to pick a number which are a limited number, a selection of which are priorities. Those that relate to infrastructure we find are highly correlated with others. And if infrastructure is done well, it can have kind of, through these interrelationships that you describe, it can have these kind of cascading benefits. So I think that if one is to sort of target one or any, then things like SDG 9 or the Sustainable Communities one, those can have kind of really strong kind of cascading benefits.
Thank you very much. Delphina, you had asked a question along data gaps and to which extent the Ghana project goes into gathering a pipeline and the approach. Could you please pose your question, and then we can see what type of response. And thank you for, if you just please remember to unmute, you're still on mute, and thank you very much.
Sorry, should I place the questions?
You can go ahead, yes.
Okay, okay, thank you, Scott, for the presentation. It was really interesting. I come in a good part from the policy space in Argentina, so I understand how many processes go. And one of the key points that came out when you were talking was like, how did they do with the data gaps and the data challenges in putting all that assessment forward? The issues of data has been a key point in every discussion on sustainable finance in general, which is my main specialization, but also on infrastructure projects. So that's one. This came up when I was hearing you on the Ghana report, so maybe that gives some context. That's one question. And the other one is in terms of the pipeline, if the project involved going all the way forward into building out a pipeline or guiding the build-up of a pipeline, and to what extent, if there was this pipeline effort, pipeline generation effort, was it like a sector approach, or was it approaching through systems of infrastructure? Because and here's a personal opinion, but every time I interact with the infrastructure space, it is very much defined in sector verticals. And when I think of sustainability and resilience, I feel like the sector verticals sometimes act as a limitation. So I was wondering that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Delphina. Great questions as well. Data gaps, it's a big issue for many things, at least not this type of analysis. I think there is reason to be optimistic, in particular for this type of analysis, that we are seeing an ever-increasing number of geospatial data sets. We use our phones every day, and that's helping to make geospatial data the norm. Now, there still are lots of data gaps, but definitely we see innovation helping in this space. And indeed, we often look to innovative methods for trying to fill data gaps in, for example, infrastructure network data or hazard data or others. But there are some times when you just have to put your hands up and say, we can't say anything about this in this area. And there's an incredible importance here in transparency when seeking to inform decision makers. Within our tool, we kind of have a 3-grade system of how we characterize our level of confidence and certainty in different data sets. And we use that to kind of communicate our certainty in any finding to decision makers. And we strongly believe we have a responsibility in that area. So we need to be innovative where we can, but where we can't, we need to be transparent. And cataloging forms of uncertainty are useful to be able to communicate with decision makers. Secondly, on the pipeline, I couldn't agree with you more of the need for a systems approach here and the way in which representing the interconnectivity between different infrastructures, both physically, but also at institutional levels. In different studies, we incorporate different data sets. So for example, in St. Lucia, we seek to characterize cascading risks from certain sectors to others, whether that's from the power system, the way in which electricity provides services that are essential for hospitals, schools, water pumping, and we seek to try to capture the ripples in the pond, the way in which a failure might cascade and the broad impacts can be characterized. But that can also be there on the solution side. So for example, in the Ghana project, although we're looking and we have a sectoral focus in the way that we try to communicate the work, because ultimately it needs to go back to these sort of vertical ministries of energy, water and transport, through identifying, and that's kind of an inherent part of government, which these cross-sectoral infrastructure ministries can really help to kind of deal with. But that's a bit of a side note. To answer the question there, it's that exploring solutions that can benefit multiple sectors is incredibly important. So I think it was that I think in the 36 projects, I think 11 of them were cross-sectoral. So, and nature-based solutions, again, provide an incredibly important route here. Schemes that seek to use the hazard protection function of nature-based solutions often offer benefits across different sectors. So when thinking here about trying to mobilize public finances, or at least demonstrate the business case for adaptation in sectors, one often can benefit from taking this cross-sectoral approach. Not only is it more efficient, but there's good argumentation for communicating benefits, which are often lost in a sort of siloed approach. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Dan Lamy, you had a question about adaptation plans shown broadly aligned with national infrastructure development plans. Could you pose your question, and please make sure that you remember to unmute yourself.
Unmute, yes. Can you hear me, David?
Yes, we can.
It's good to see you again, David. I haven't seen you since 2013, I think. Scott, thanks again for the great presentation. I think I'd like to jump on the question that is, how broadly do you see that alignment, especially with the Ghana case? I think that's always a broader set of a problem with the infrastructure plans matching with the adaptation plans. And I think piggybacking off what Delphina said in terms of the systems, I'll approach it differently in terms of the integration between the subnational governments, because what generally happens is different governments tiers are responsible for funding sort of different aspects. And in fact, most of the bills of certain types of infrastructure, let's say road networks, which are maybe under a subnational, at a subnational level, and would be impacted and would be under the purview of a subnational entity. So I was just wondering, I guess, so it builds on the systems, but maybe not looking at the integration of the different ministries, but also sort of an integration of the different government tiers, as may be in a case like Ghana. I know St. Lucia is probably one single unitary system, so with like 200,000 people, but I'm sure Ghana gives us a bigger, healthier sample. Yeah, so that's sort of my question. I'd love to hear UNOPS' approach to that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Danlami. Another great question, and indeed, it's great to have Ghana as a case study. I think it's much more representative. St. Lucia is a fantastic place to work, but they all represent their individual challenges and opportunities. With regards to this question, our approach to it was to map out the government and the processes of adaptation decisions between different parts of government from across these different levels. So from Ministry of Planning all the way down to across to the sector ministries, and then down into the individual agencies that work, as you indicate, subnationally and often regionally. So the first point was to map these out, to kind of understand which entities are there and how they interrelate to each other. And indeed, who has authority in which areas, where are the responsibilities, and under which agreements do certain plans nest. So that was our first route into this. And I think our approach then practically in the project was to assemble a technical working group within the project of, I think, 24 different entities within government are represented, which has a reasonable cross-section of these agencies, not every single one, but a large number of them that were then a part of this process from the beginning in terms of validating data through prioritizing needs, through prioritizing and selecting adaptation options. I think that those things were helpful, but it also highlighted what a huge amount of more work there is to do. I think it really sort of touches there's just so much more to do in that area to try to align and coordinate between these different separate entities. We found that some of them align well with, say, the Ghana National Infrastructure Plan. Some do not. And there were many reasons for that. And I think we were able to observe some of these inconsistencies or great alignments, but the extent to which we could deal with them in this project was a little bit limited, but there's a lot of good work that can be done to improve efficiencies and this type of process. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you, Danlami, for asking the question. It's time to move on to our next speaker. I want to introduce you to Mónica. She and I have a common history at the World Association of PPP Units and Professionals, WAP. She is a colleague and a practitioner with extensive experience in PPPs, including nature-based solutions and investment planning for infrastructure. Mónica, if you could take the floor, we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, David, and an honor to be here, everyone, and to virtually meet you at least. One moment, this should work. Okay, so yeah, like Danilo and David said before, what I will be talking to you about is about investment planning on their uncertainty, but also what the PPP role could be in enabling a transition to a more sustainable, hopefully regenerative economy. Maybe also just very quickly about Now Partners, where I'm part of. We are a group of 100+ senior business leaders and change experts who, all in all, what we want to do is to influence leadership styles, the business logic, and hopefully also multi-sector systems so that we can transition to a more regenerative economy. Let me see, one is not moving, okay. And yeah, like I said, we do that working with leaders, with companies and systems. But okay, now to the point. No, I think COVID-19 has been quite a reminder for us of a number of pending crises. That's what we see now, COVID-19. We're not yet out of it, but of course we already see coming, and many people are experiencing the economic impact of that. Climate change is the next wave, and maybe even a bigger wave is the biodiversity challenge, right? So I think rightly also the Club of Rome, for example, has stated that we are under a planetary emergency. And I think none of us can forget about this systemic risk and the importance. So the question here is, how are our PPP models and contracts withstanding these crises, and how can they withstand them, or even better, maybe contribute to the solutions of these challenges? So, I mean, because of the planetary emergency we are facing, we also, I mean, companies, governments, everyone is starting to understand that nature, more than regulation and others, is the real license to operate, right? The way we have been developing until now, or increase our systemic vulnerability, for example, the way we expand our cities, or we grow our food, or deplete our resources. I think it was somewhere in July when already we finished the resources for this year. One of our partners in now is the person behind this campaign on the Global Overshoot Day. And all in all, I mean, 9 out of the 10 greatest humanity risks are linked to lack of water. So the point is that water, right, connects us to everything else, and everything we do in the built environment impact also the water cycle. The World Bank study already of 2016 said also that the most of the impacts of climate change are felt through the water cycle, right? Rain, temperatures, and so forth. So it's quite clear that we need to do major changes. I think the Global Commission of Adaptation call to action already call us for 3 major revolutions: understanding the interdependencies between our investment decisions, a change in how we plan, and also a change in how we finance. So if we look at, because we're going to look at planning, investment planning on their uncertainty. So let's look at the infrastructure investment cycle. This is how the OECD has mapped it in a very simplified way. So, and let's look specifically at the planning, then the project development, and the project implementation phase. So, I mean, these can be 15 or maybe longer year processes, traditionally very siloed. I think, like everybody was saying, even within the same ministry, there is the people who plan for water, there is people for plan for transport, for example, in the case of ministries of public works. And the evaluation is done on a project per project basis, which make it also very, very costly and you could say cumbersome. But as we advance from left to right, we all know that you have less and less design freedom. And so when we have projects already in the pipeline, for example, in project development, to make them climate proof, it becomes every time more costly because you have to rethink the basics of this project. I mean, we all know that there is uncertainty, what we call deep uncertainty, and I'll show you later. What's the difference between risk and deep uncertainty is that we have changing climatic conditions, right? Like water availability, but also changing demands and societal priorities. So these, for example, if we have super long processes from the moment you identify a need to the moment that you're really building the stuff could be like 15 years. And we cannot predict anymore the future with the numbers of the past, we have a big problem, right? Because also when this already the pipeline, for example, in Chile, where I'm working, what is now part of the water infrastructure plan that was thought like years ago, but they had not been able to implement many of these projects. Well, you don't know if you have the water availability to build them or if they make sense anymore, right? So maybe the projects are not more feasible, or they have so much significantly different requirements that you have to rethink what you were planning to do. but also from the moment that you decide to tender it, right? And then you give the concession or a PPP to a party, then there could be all those changes also would change significantly the cash flow profile and the risk profile of the project, threatening the financial viability. Or what we also see in many places, the social license to operate those infrastructures. So how do we deal now with this issue? And so what we see is that there are a number of tools. I won't go that in detail in all these tools because of the time, but I've tried to make references so you can click here and find more information. During the infrastructure planning and master planning phase, for example, it's good to look also not just at risk, but at deep uncertainty. And what we call deep uncertainty is really when you cannot even characterize, define ranges. And so depending on the type of uncertainty, right, you could use different tools, like, for example, assumption-based planning and robust decision-making that groups like RAND have been developing, adaptive policymaking also, adaptation pathways or dynamic adaptive policy pathways that also colleagues, for example, at Altamirano have been working on, and adaptation tipping points. So that's good for when we're deciding what should we do at all, right? Like when we're very early in the planning process, but maybe also later when we have other projects in the pipeline, we are looking more at climate risk management techniques. I mean, there is a variety of them and manuals developed for that. For example, the IFC has developed tools for different sectors like ports and waterways and so forth. And then there is also, of course, for example, the use of real options for engineering and asset management, or other techniques like climate value at risk that could allow us to know what would be the consequences of climate changes and risk, not only in the damage of the asset, because I think that's what we know the most, but in business continuity, right? And foregone revenues. And then when you go, say, we already will, to look at those risks after you have given the contract out to a private sector, I think it's also good to look at the possibilities of dynamic contracting, the rethinking of risk allocation. You will see a little example in a moment, but also just the use of smart contracts and you really exploiting digitalization as an enabler for a more adaptive management of these risks. This, to give you an idea, it's a bit not so sharp, I'm so sorry, but you will find a paper in this link. I mean, when we look now let's take adaptive policy making, that I think it sets the base for if we want to set up a contract and if we want to decide what to do, which investments make sense in the future, even when we don't know what changes could happen, is that we have to put central here, for example, like I think before also Scott and others were saying, so definition of success, it has to be very clear, agreed with everyone what is the accepted or desired levels of services and of risks. And then you can go into assembling, they would say here a basic policy, but basically that could also be like a master plan, a combination of structural and non-structural measures. And understanding those vulnerabilities, you can decide that for those that are certain, of course, you already take mitigation actions in the design, but for those that are not certain, you have hedging actions. And that could also be like extra capacity, for example, in your port, right? That you have different cranes if there is too much wind, so that you can, at that moment, kind of adaptively deal with it. And then what is really important, though, is that to have all those signposts. Now, what are those things that you will be monitoring so that you would trigger or a reassessment, maybe even of the contract, or corrective actions or defensive actions. And what you will see here, though, is that to do this, we really need to understand, right, and set up these contracts more than the basic legal structures, understand this system. And I'll just put a graph, and I mean, we don't, not to go in the details, and maybe it's not to overload you, but I mean, I'm a systems engineer, so I really like to do these graphs, but it's more to say, we need to understand, right, how this, for example, this is a port, how that port and all the assets interrelate with each other, how they are affected by different climate variables, and if over a certain threshold, how they can start to fail, making others fail, like a domino effect. And also in that is very important, again, to have very clear the outcomes of interest, the levels of services that you want to ensure. And like you see here, the final outcomes, right? Because what we see more and more happening, especially around water services, for example, is that it's not just the direct impact, it's kind of the indirect impact through how the society react to these failures, no? So is understanding the asset, in this case, for example, a whole port terminal is quite complex, has many assets, but also how it relates to a bigger system that could be also the natural environment in which we operate. And so per sector, I think like we have seen before, there are like very detailed tools, and then there is also kind of the possibility also, I think for PPP here is quite important to think, therefore, if you know that those vulnerabilities, what will be the risk allocation, how much the public sector keep, how much they transfer, and maybe also you may need to use insurance, no, for some things that none of them can carry and that it makes sense. But I think that choice has to be done with extreme care, because in the past, I think it was already in 2005 that I was doing my PhD on PPP in road networks. Public sector can tend to give these risks that nobody, like risk to the private sector that from a economical and societal point of view, it would be best the public sector keeps, because if the private sector has to act as an insurance for that, when they don't have control over that, is really not, you would say, efficient. No, so those we have to think very much behind. And an example that has also been seen as an example, for example, by the IFC is you have sector groups like PIANC, that's the, oh gosh, now I forgot, but it's the World Association of Ports and of Maritime Transport, directors, like you have PIARC for roads. They have a permanent task group on climate change also, where these are continuously discussed. No, now we go to dealing with that uncertainty, in contracting. So when we go to that part, we see there are also a variety of tools. For example, here the World Bank has put out in 2018 a guideline how to address climate risk in performance-based contracts, right? So understanding criticality, vulnerability, threat, consequences, adaptation. This is also quite closely related to some concepts I think that Stefan was putting out yesterday, that maybe the report they have now is kind of the next generation on this. But also let's go back to risk transfer. And I think I see Jan there, and he's very familiar with this project too. I think is one of the first projects in the world where you have flood protection being put in a PPP. So this is a broadland flood alleviation project that combines green and gray and natural infrastructure for flood protection. And as you see here, there are some shared risk, right? Like severe weather. So you have clear thresholds above which they will sit together with the Environment Agency and manage it, because it's just not economically efficient and responsible to leave that only to the private sector. But what is the way forward, right? Because we saw all this, and then we start to get into very much detail for each of those sectors, what to do, how to use them. And this is my opinion more after looking first at roads, then at water adaptation from many angles, is that we really need a new infrastructure planning approach. And I think some of you already have been talking about it, right? Because it doesn't make sense to keep planning per each of the sectors and then find out that these things do not fit together. Then find out that you're building a road in an area that is blocking the path of water, therefore the road will be vulnerable to floods, and you're actually causing maybe floods to other areas that you didn't want it flooded. So we need an expert approach to natural investment systems, not really work on multi-sectoral plans for transformation, because I think, whether we develop or emerging economies, transformation is needed. Like the issue of the transition is also an issue, for example, in Belgium, as it is, and in Ghana, right? So, and a process that considers the systemic risk at watershed level, and we can discuss that in another time, but more and more is recognized that the watershed is the best unit of planning for different infrastructures, because you consider the whole dynamic of the water cycle. That is where we will feel the climate change, no? participatory planning, transdisciplinary collaboration, and of course, like we have discussed before, when you from the start look at the role of ecosystems, like critical infrastructure networks, no, like the rest. Now, this is the planning part. Then there is the procurement part. And I think all the people here are converted, but it's quite an issue to have early private sector involvement. And that's in fact why I'm joined these now partners, because working from the public side, it has turned very difficult to engage the private sector. There is from both sides like a fear, no, to engage, but we need to find ways that where we have enough trust from the community, from the public and the private to do this in the most transparent way. So, and where we also evaluate not just project per project, but clusters of projects that are interdependent, no? And that can then deliver together those levels of service that we want. What's something that really needs more attention, and where I think the PPP community has much to say, is how do we design those governance structures, no, for collective investments? Because this requires a lot of times investments in beyond the farm, for example, if we're talking about agriculture issues, but also water management. So what would be blended finance is a must. Climate finance could have a big role in this. And maybe, hopefully, then we go towards a regenerative economy. I won't go in this in much detail because my time is quite limited. But what I wanted to say, the most important issue here is that we have to have a better discussion of the what and the how, you know, before we finish a beautiful plan that nobody will implement because it's too costly, or there is no private sector appetite, or nobody can maintain because we have put a too complex infrastructure in place, is to really have this what and the how, no? And so if it's not possible in the short term, then you face it, or you rethink what you were planning to do, right? So taking into account always central the level of service. I will go super quickly here. Sorry. This is an example. I don't know if somebody here is from Chile, but we can discuss after. I'm working there for the Ministry of Public Works and Inter-American Development Bank, because they also have a plan that you see there, but okay, how do we implement it, right? And what you see there is that they really want to go towards a process of the watershed as the unit of planning of multiple infrastructures. So that the movement is getting there. But maybe before going in the next slide, when I started, I thought, okay, climate, water availability is such a big problem. But even if you talk with the mining companies, yeah, there's a big problem, but they are finding technological solutions for that. But the big problem is the perception people are having about monosectoral infrastructure investments, right? There is a distrust that when you're just investing for the farmers, for example, that's not benefiting everyone. Or why should we have those large infrastructures if we also go for nature-based solutions? So it is quite important to, and then the social license, the juridical risk, because the whole water rights system is being, which is very important for Chile's system of water governance, is being discussed, right? And that's because a lot of people in rural areas, for example, don't have access to proper services. So it's saying climate could be the trigger, but actually I think other things will be much more challenging. But there are hopeful changes. I think the infrastructure sector, I have been quite active with the World Economic Forum and the Global Infrastructure Hub on what is called the development of infrastructure 4.0. No? And what is that? It's forward-looking infrastructure that leverage the power of technology and information to really though focus the plans around social outcomes, no, and considering that infrastructure as a system of systems. And here you see an example, no, the UK through a very important process of 75 industry leaders, they come to a new vision for the built environment that is to enable people and nature to flourish together for the generations to come, right? And what you see here is that that part, you know, in the middle between beautiful goals at national, global level, and before you start to build, this is where we need to strengthen capacity, right? To combine and make these trade-offs. Yes, and so yeah, basically the digital revolution can be a big enabler because we could have, for example, trustworthy, consistent, and global sources of data that would allow us to make more kind of coordinated action and investments and lower transaction costs. I'm here in the last bit, and I would go in much detail, but you can see the whole report. So how do we finance, right? Because we have to change the way we have been doing these things quite significantly. So that's where climate finance can play a big role, right? Unlocking the private sector as an untapped source of expertise, capacity to innovate, not only finance, which I think most of the people look at that. I won't go into these things, but the two main problems here, though, are still prohibitive transaction costs for private sector to invest in adaptation and transition-related implementation risk. Quitting the, oh no, okay, maybe you can read, I will leave you there, you can read the report here, but here, maybe just to say in a review that I have done of the 3 largest multilateral climate funds and also what MDBs have done, you would see that most of them have focused on the technical and the financial barriers for access to finance and implementation of adaptation from the private sector. But very little work has been done in the institutional quality of governance structures and the environment. And I do think that as PPP practitioners, and with the knowledge we have of how to design contracts, how to define this design performance-based contracts that incentivize the right private sector attitude, it's crucial that that knowledge is to the service of strengthening that point. So with that, I'd like to, you can see here, I mean, where we can put that climate finance so that we really exponentially increase private sector investments in adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica, and I hope I didn't push you too much to...
No, it's okay.
Because we do want to do the question and answer session. I just wanted to ask Jan van Schoonhoven of the EBRD had a question for you, Monica, and he basically says you mentioned early involvement in the private sector, and that kind of ties into a question that I was also, wanted to ask you is, what is the private sector's voice? Do they have a voice? How do they get their views, their thoughts along? But I'll let Jan ask the question, and I think we asking a similar thing. So please fire away, Jan.
Yes, thank you, David. Hi, Monica. So good to see you, and thank you for this presentation. Can you hear me? Because I had some starting problems. Okay, that's good. Look, you mentioned the private sector, and I think in all projects, climate adaptation or not, the private sector plays a crucial role in developing new ideas from the start to the beginning. And my question was actually, you mentioned a big holistic private sector, and my question consists of 2 parts. If you talk in your presentation about the private sector, do you have a specific private sector identity in your mind? Is that a construction company, a consulting company, a financial company? And the second, and maybe more interesting even, is if we talk about climate adaptation, should we use other private sector partners in an early stage than our usual suspects that we do in our traditional projects or our traditional PPP projects? Thank you, Monica, for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan. So, I mean, you're right, and it was out of time, but one of the things in the report that you will see is that I'll put different roles for the private sector, because like you say, I think there also we get a lot confused. So, I mean, you have financiers, right? But I think their role is there, and I would mostly focus on real economy players, right? So like private sector who could benefit from investing in adaptation, that's like value companies in a value chain, or beverage companies and so forth, who get the direct benefits of reducing this risk. And then you have service providers, right? Where it could be construction companies and others. And I think some point that I also made there is people want to go too quickly to private sector like financiers, but nobody has involved them first as service providers, and their risk perception would go much down. Like, I mean, I think we're speaking the converted here, but would go down exponentially. If they are a service provider first, then they can become investors, like we saw that in many infrastructure networks, right? So other players, definitely, because like you see, for example, early warning systems, near real-time data providers will become crucial in this new type of projects. So there is need for public sector leadership to have a 10 to 15 years process in mind to create new markets, right? When I think like we saw, I don't know, maybe already 20 years ago, you start with maintenance contracts in one side, design build contracts in another, and slowly you will go to PPP, maybe integrated contracts. So we need that process and identify, maybe like you say, the non-traditional ones along the way. So there was another question, David, I thought.
No, I think just in the sense of engaging the private sector, and you've answered that, when do we, because often, people come with policies and practices, but it's very much public sector centric. And then the private sector feels that it's left out, and especially investors, as well, why would we invest in your project? It's your idea, it's not our idea type of thing. And so I think you answered.
Okay. Yeah. I can say a little bit about that, because additionally is that it is very difficult. And I found out, because private sector, especially around water, for example, and adaptation, they are very concerned to lose their social license. So to get engaged in these processes is a little bit like, are we dealing with the right public sector counterpart? Are we not getting in trouble? So there is a fear there. At the same time, there are changes. There are like pension funds, Norwegian and other more Nordic pension funds, for example, trying to put people to be engaged in those processes because they want to invest in water, and adaptation. And so they need to get people to understand these things. And also you see, actually, there is a group in US, for example, so private sector investing in smaller projects of nature conservation, for example, just to understand the metrics and understand it much better. So they are investing actually in a project. They will be invest here in a project in the Netherlands, which is weird, some US party, right? But to get that knowledge so that they can become investors in the future, because there is a lot of appetite for that. David, back to you.
Thank you. Chibiza, I see your hand up, but I'm going to ask Doreen Wong first. You had a question. You mentioned that early private sector involvement is key. Would you be interested in hearing more? Doreen, if you could fire away with your question, I'd appreciate that.
Thanks very much, David. Hi, Mónica. Thanks very much for the great presentation. You mentioned in one of the slides under procurement strategy that early private sector involvement is key. And I know we've just been discussing about private sector involvement. I'd be interested in hearing more about how best to get that early private sector engagement, particularly when in these procurements, these are public sector procurements, so the whole idea of fair, open, and transparent and running clean procurement processes. So how do we maintain or achieve the balance between running a clean procurement process and also having the opportunity to engage with private sector?
Thank you. Yeah, and that's of course a very tricky part. So one is, I think that when you would engage them in the very early strategic planning, right? We're still kind of playing with options, right? So we're not yet kind of having a specific deals. The challenge is they think, why would I be engaged then? Because it's too early. So that's the part that I must say is something I'm trying to look, for example, if companies who want to be the so-called benefit corporations, and others who they say they want to have a good impact, trying to convince them maybe you can have a better impact, not just putting money, but putting your expertise to the service of the planning process. Because the reason I think they should be involved, and I think we all would agree, you could come to much different options if they are part, right? That they are not. They have these nose for economic viability and financial sustainability that private public sector lack. So that's one thing. And the other is, for example, I think in the Netherlands also there was an experience, right? Because say when you want to fine tune things about the procurement, which risk do you give and not? too many risks were given in the early, I mean, in the past, I don't know anymore, I lost track. Jan is here, he must know much better, but there were some years where some concessions were given where really too much risk went to the private sector. And that's because they wanted, of course, to win the concession, right? But some of them went bankrupt. So then the government started this kind of like market vision breakfast, which been pre-competitive and more generic. So they're not talking about a specific deal, but about, okay, if we would put in concession the lock system, what would be doable, what not? And so, yes, there are some experiences there. Thank you, Darlene.
Great.
Where are you from? Where are you based?
I'm based in Canada. I'm with Robinson Global Management in Canada. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Last question to Mónica, and then we'll open the floor for a general discussion. Chibizo, if you could please ask your question, please put your camera on and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mónica, for quite a wonderful presentation. I was just wondering, I mean, the myriad of challenges that these projects present. Have you seen any examples of improvements in regulatory framework to include, climate change issues that has been helpful in managing these challenges? Are there any clear indicators that you have seen?
Good question. I need a little thinking. For example, some of these are happening. There are discussions now happening, for example, in the National Water Board, of Chile, when they're saying, okay, do we want to move from per project evaluation, and because they have a very strict process of evaluation, is a very long process, to more at the watershed level and a little bit more like cluster. So there is not approved yet, right? But there is that thinking, and probably they will require that. Further, I think it is more. I need to think a little bit more.
Okay, that's fine.
Maybe it will come to your minds.
Yes.
We're going to enter into just the open floor discussion on both topics now. And to launch this, I was wondering, Scott, because you were the first speaker, if you maybe have a question that you'd like to ask Mónica to get this cross synthesis, and then I'm going to ask Mónica to also ask you, Scott, a question for cross synthesis, and then we'll open into the general discussion again. So, Scott, just remember to unmute, and if you could fire away the question you might have.
Yeah, thank you, David, and Mónica, thanks a lot for a really super interesting presentation. My question relates a bit to some of the other questions around engaging private sector financiers. You mentioned, I think it was a point around engagement on nature conservancy, the conservation of nature. And I wondered about if you have if you'd be able to expand upon that. We see a huge amount of increase in nature-based solutions and their role in being a solution for adaptation. And I wondered the sort of general appetite from private sector financiers, and if you've seen anything that might work there as a hook to get people interested in that type of asset class. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. That's so coincidentally, yeah, but I think from 2016 until last year, I've been working in this European project, Horizon 2020, on nature insurance values. So looking at those arrangements, that allow for investments in nature-based solutions. So we do see there are some collective investment vehicles like the waterfronts in Latin America. Honestly, I think we could improve their institutional design a little bit further, but there is the idea of beverage companies and others kind of together, right? Putting some money to make investments at watershed level. But unfortunately, these are voluntary. So they don't make yet the step to do investments at scale. There are advances in parametric insurance schemes, like in the coral reefs in Cancun. So, for example, there the Nature Conservancy work with Swiss Re the insurance group to develop this contract in which, I mean, or this parametric insurance in which hotel owners, they pay to ensure the coral reef, and if there is a storm, there is they just measure the strength of the storm, and then there is an immediate payout so that people would repair the coral reef, because it's quite important for their flood protection. So there are those advances. I think they were also thinking about a similar one in the Netherlands. So another one is that, well, you have the public procurement process. Peru is one place that is very much advanced in that. They introduced in 2016 like 1% additional to the water bill, and with that they have created a fund so that they can invest in green in the ecosystems that treat the water and so forth. There I must say that you see again that the knowledge of procurement, because it's so different to procure nature-based solutions, right? The asset class has a completely different cash flow profile. Nobody knows honestly, very little people know the function curve, like we know them for bridges and things. So there is a lot of problem there, because Peru, for example, people, the money is stuck actually. The money is there now, and it's not so easy to put it in projects, because the procurement and the capacity to procure those things is very limited. So that's, and then there are environmental markets like the water, like the stormwater markets in DC, where that's real estate will pay, right? To if they build somewhere here for somewhere else to be space for water to be drain or capture. I forgot now the word, but so there are advances. And just last week, there is a coalition of private investors in conservation. They launched this conservation finance report that's put the state of conservation finance. Thank you.
Thank you. Mónica, maybe you have a question for Scott before I give Danlami a chance.
Yes, I have, because when you were presenting, part of my time I worked at Altamirano, so there is a lot of this modeling, and I think we discussed before, right, that you came from there and go into the economics and policy. And I was wondering how easy or difficult it has turned to really have these kind of equal collaboration between experts and communities and local actors, and how much are you advancing the local absorption capacity for those studies?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I would say that our collective learning has been that it's really difficult to go from to get new practices absorbed and taken up within governments to become the mainstream. I think it's really tough, it's really challenging, and it takes a lot of resource. Of course, it's contextually, what we notice, in fact, is that it's really dependent on the context. And we've now learned to take quite a lot of time at the beginning of one of these studies to really try to understand the landscape of the enabling environment within a government, and who makes decisions, where this type of data and analysis can fit into processes and flows within kind of information flows or processes for the way in which projects are assessed or developed. We also try to think about the way in which knowledge experts who might use these tools, often we engage local universities or in some cases consultancies, where countries engage a local consultant or have a capacity in that area, and that's just the way things are done. So we've learned that things are different in many contexts, and that time spent to understand that landscape is well spent to try to have a solution that is more appropriate. The second component, I would say, is really just buy-in from the beginning, and to ensure that the local government officials are a part of the process from the beginning. So to sort of move away from this sort of traditional doing work in one particular, or doing work remotely from a country, and where possible to fully involve those who are expected to be end users of the tool right from the beginning of the analysis for that report. That it's not just done by an external consultant, that the person who will be using it, that tool or expected to use that tool in 1 year's time, that they're doing the assessment hand in hand with the technical experts from the start, so that they've gone through the experience of doing it once already. So they're just a couple of things, but it's really difficult, and it's hard to cost and resource those things, and like many things, deserves more time, money, resources to be able to ensure it's better done. Yeah, thanks, Mónica.
Thank you very much, Scott. We have questions, time for 2 more questions. So I'm going to ask Dan Lamy if you could please pose your question, and thank you for taking off mute.
Thank you. I'll be very quick. And this question is both for Scott and Mónica. And I think I was listening to a very orderly process with lots of information and basically things that don't exist in a third of the climates, right? What effectively happens is actually it's the opposite. The private sector is engaged way too early. So they come up with unsolicited proposals. You're sitting on your desk and something comes at you from the minister's office, from the presidency or whatever, to treat a road that there are no road counts, no traffic counts, no hydrology for bridges, nothing. So at this point now, what we're looking at is the sort of information asymmetry that causes poor risk allocation, which is what we've been talking about and going through the process to allocate risk. And that's kind of why I like the adaptation framework, because it even helps to give some discipline to the process to say, oh, does it meet these tests, you know, of certain adaptive features that would help us triage some of these projects better, because a lot of the times it doesn't come from the policy and planning units. Very few of the projects do, and I was curious to know from Scott's experience in Ghana and maybe Monica's experience, if many of those projects were actually developed in-house in the policy of planning, or were actually results of a compilation of unsolicited proposals, so to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. The last person I'm going to ask, because we're almost out of time, is Delphina. If you could please pose your question and remember to take off mute.
Hi, sorry, I was running out of battery. Yes, my questions, they were fairly early. Let me go back to them. Yes, I was quite intrigued to learn more about the adaptive policy making. And I was wondering, a little bit also in line with my question, the question that I posed to Scott, and breaking the sector verticals kind of approach, but with adaptive policymaking, to what extent are current PPP practices, to what extent would this practice allow to integrate these? And related to that is, in the projects you've seen, I guess there may not be many, but how much more time does it require to approach a project like that? And the reason why I ask this is because the incentives in PPPs and in putting up infrastructure projects, including politics priorities, are quite complex, and timing, more so when you're on political timings, are a challenge. And if you have too many people, too many players that come from with a business as usual approach, you put this on the table and they kind of like, yes, it's very important, but they send it down to the bottom. And then all the citizens pay the cost of that, of course. But I was wondering to what extent there are in current PPP practices silver lines or margin to include adaptive policymaking.
Thank you. And fire ahead, Mónica.
Oh, how do you want to go? Because we have this two. So shall I go ahead with the last one and then we go back to the first question?
However you wish.
Okay. So maybe just very much the last. I think it would take definitely time, but I would think that it's also a matter of having it done once for different typologies of assets, right? So it is not like you will. It's almost like we have those standard contracts, right? And risk allocations for certain things. We just need to rethink some of our standards. So that's one thing. And the other is, I do think that, I mean, we could also reduce some of these transaction costs if we evaluate clusters of projects at watershed level. So there is like something to to win back from some of these elements, because then you consider the interdependencies between this and private. The last thing is that I think, and you already are in the finance space, whether the government does it or the financiers do it, because through those disclosure requirements that we have now, they'll have anyway to look at these interdependencies. So in a way, there is this push from the financiers to get there somehow. So that's for the, and then I would leave Scott to answer first the other question, and then I can also answer.
I think you're muted, David. But
we have to keep our answers very succinct because we are almost out of time.
Okay, thank you. Danlami, thanks again for the question. Indeed, our experience has been that projects emerge from a variety of ever increasingly interesting places. Certainly many are unsolicited, but some have their origins in analysis and deep thinking and consultation from ministries. I would say here 2 recommendations. One is looking towards more centralized tools, databases that can house projects within governments and that can help when, say, for example, a Ministry of Finance in Ghana through PIAB, the part of government that's sort of looking to push projects, if they have, or they've been looking towards the development of a central tool that can store information on projects that exist across government, but that also exist in different investment agencies that tend to be the kind of receptacle for private sector approaches. And secondly, then it's around capacity development and process. What's the process for pushing these things through? What are the mechanisms? And again, they need to kind of streamline projects, their proposal documentation through concept pre-feasibility, feasibility. Having standardization across the piece can help to ensure that approaches are kind of aligned and consistent and more efficiently managed with limited resources.
Thank you. Do you have a final comment, Mónica?
Just very quick. So I mean, I think that have seen this process also in Manila Bay. There are many unsolicited proposals from the private sector to do land reclamations, and therefore the National Planning Authority asked, in this case, the Netherlands to help develop these master plan that basically was like a zoning, right? And deciding where you definitely don't want more land reclamations and where they could happen. And just like David said, you need like these central tools. So the Inter-American Development Bank is investing, for example, for Latin America in this thing called Hydrobit that would allow to kind of do those what-if analysis a bit quicker.
Thank you. We're out of time. I just want to close out very quickly. One message that came across very strongly was the importance of engaging all parties from conceptualization of the projects. I think this is critically important. Danlami, one thing it's a pity we didn't have more time to talk about it, but we do have to have a very good structure in place for unsolicited proposals, because that can sort of often result in the process being short-circuited. There are numerous tools that we have been introduced to. I would take the opportunity to explore them. And then just one thing which was mentioned a few times, and this is what we are doing here, capacity building of institutions is incredibly important. And this workshop is one of those efforts where hopefully once you have finished this training, that you will go back to your home teams and share this information with them and make it a general practice. Thank you very much. I'm just going to hand over for a few seconds to our host and just for any closeout questions or comments from GCA.
Thank you very much, David. And of course, thank you very much, Scott and Mónica, for 2 very interesting presentations and full of insights. And of course, thank you to all the participants for presenting such great questions. I think that really stimulated some discussions. And I think that's exactly what this masterclass is about. So I hope that you have enjoyed this session.